When The Mandalorian premiered on Disney+, one of the things that made Star Wars live-action episodic TV debut so special was how ably it evoked the wonder of the original trilogy while also forging its own unique path through the galaxy after the fall of the Galactic Empire. The Mandalorian and Grogu, the big screen debut of Din Djarin and his adoptive son, and the first new Star Wars movie in 7 years, gets caught almost immediately in a feedback loop of self-satisfied nostalgia, which it seldom pulls out of. I'm Tom Jorgensen, and this is my review of The Mandalorian and Grogu.
There comes a time where we all have to say goodbye.
Get out of there, Mando.
This is the way.
The Mandalorian and Grogu's plot is dead simple. The two of them are contracted by the New Republic's Colonel Ward to bring in the late Jabba the Hutt's adult son Rada at the behest of Jabba's twin siblings, who are eager to continue consolidating power after their failed attempts to do so on Tatooine during the events of the Book of Boba Fett. While technically a follow-up to the third season of The Mandalorian, which concludes with Din Djarin and Grogu settling on Navarro and agreeing to work for the New Republic, The Mandalorian and Grogu draws from effectively zero of that groundwork, to a degree that is completely perplexing. Director Jon Favreau and Lucasfilm boss Dave Filoni spent 3 seasons on Disney Plus building out characters and cultures specific to this corner of the Star Wars galaxy, and by design, this film feels like it's laser focused on catering to people who have only heard about the show. Look, maybe that provides a cleaner jumping on point for general audiences, and those who are brand new to this way of experiencing the galaxy will likely find some satisfaction in watching The Mandalorian go through the same motions of trying to get a job done while both babysitting and training Grogu. But for any Star Wars fans who haven't been frozen in carbonite for the last few years, it leaves most of the developments here feeling duplicative of turns that we've already taken in the series. It's like poetry. It rhymes. With things the majority of the audience will have experienced more recently than the last Star Wars movie we all went to see in theaters.
That's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
No, George, I already said—
That's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
Oh, never mind. By virtue of having his name added to the title, you would imagine that Grogu would have a lot more agency in this movie. But as such an outsized presence in the film, his weakness as a character starts to come into stark relief. We do see Grogu take a more active role in action scenes, like when he takes off after Rada in a stroller that seemingly has the top speed of a pod racer. But the movie almost never hands out any negative consequences to Grogu for his impulsivity, so there's very little novelty to watching him make the little stinker move every time and face no consequences. The Mandalorian TV series largely avoids having to interrogate that dynamic by utilizing Grogu as a pivot point for Din Djarin's journey, forcing the bounty hunter to make choices and change based on his relationship with the little green guy. That means that The Mandalorian and Grogu needed to be all the more creative to spin a worthwhile story out of watching Grogu interact with the world through what means he does have available to him, and precious little of it rises above baiting the audience with his cooing or his hungry little tummy.
You good?
Din Djarin, for his part, never has real cause to underestimate Grogu's innate ability or tentative understanding of Mandalorian ideals, and so his occasional need to change his plan of attack based on his wildcard companion doesn't usually amount to more than a quick and easy shift to plan B. This leaves Pedro Pascal, the voice of Din Djarin, feeling a little bit wooden here, as so little of what happens gives him call to modulate his performance away from the Mandalorian's staple calm. Both characters are incredibly capable and already understand each other very well by the time the movie starts, and the script from director Jon Favreau, Dave Filoni, and Noah Clore seems totally disinterested in rocking the boat. This is Star Wars at its most conflict-averse, and I can't help but notice that correlates to it also feeling like the most boring Star Wars movie yet. The Mandalorian and Grogu's drama being largely inert, we would look to the space fantasy spectacle to make up that lost ground. But the movie's action is scattershot at best. The movie's at its most exciting when Mando and Rada have to team up at one point during what's essentially a life-size game of Din Djarin, featuring the real monsters represented on the Millennium Falcon's holochess board. It's a chaotic battle that calls to mind the gladiatorial fight on Geonosis, but it's also here that The Mandalorian and Grogu's biggest flaw with its action comes into view. Mando is primarily a close-quarters fighter, but his fights here end up being a little tough to read. The movie heavily favors pitting Mando against CG creatures and droids in smaller rooms, and that often leaves Favreau's coverage looking for good angles to emphasize the work that Brendan Wayne and Lateef Crowder, Mando's physical performers, are doing to communicate Din Djarin's creativity and ruthlessness when the sabacc cards are down.
If you'd only had this little green Psylocke,
you would have beaten this.
Ludwig Göransson, the series composer, does get some chances to shine. The synth-heavy version of Mando's theme that hits when he arrives on Shikari rocks. But little of Göransson's work goes far enough towards injecting life into the movie when it needs it most, in the third act, which really drags itself over the finish line with a series of non-committal fake-outs. It feels inevitable in the years to come that the popular criticism of The Mandalorian and Grogu will likely be that it just feels like either a truncated season of the TV show or a too long episode. And it feels important to put that idea into some context here, and why taking all the highlights of what maybe could have been The Mandalorian Season 4 and making a movie out of them is such a dramatic non-starter. The Mandalorian's 8-episode seasons have the luxury of drawing stories out for 7 or 8 hours, with each individual episode more free to tweak the rhythm with which each chapter plays out, the genre conventions it leans into, and how much to let the circumstances of the plot affect change in the characters on a long-term basis. You get around 2 hours to do that in a movie, 2 hours and 12 minutes in this case, and that demands a lot more focus and discipline in how the stakes and the momentum of your story are managed. Structurally speaking, The Mandalorian and Grogu is constantly pulled between those two modes of storytelling, full of fits and jumps from the start, and with no demonstrated interest in letting anything that happens be permanent. The film's opening scene features Mando and Grogu hunting a remnant Imperial warlord on a snowy planet, but outside of giving Mando a chance to stalk hallways and take out stormtroopers for a few minutes, which we've seen him do before, this sequence winds up completely disconnected from what's to follow, and more of a warning shot than a starting gun being fired off. Each scene's utility seems only to be getting us to the next phase of the mission and jeopardizing as little as possible for Favreau and Filoni along the way, should they decide to keep this sub-franchise going in the future. The Mandalorian and Grogu, to put it into X-Files terms, is a monster of the week and not a myth-arc episode, and for a marquee cinematic event for the duo, that feels like a huge miscalculation in practice. Baffling as it is to have basically the entire cast of the show sidelined for the movie, a couple of brief and pretty unsatisfying cameos notwithstanding, there are a few supporting characters who breathe some life into the film. Sigourney Weaver's Colonel Ward is just there to hand Mando his missions and to tell him how good or bad he did on that mission, but if you need a steely commander who you'll believe would jump in an X-Wing along with the young bucks when it comes time to throw down, you could do a lot worse than Weaver and the effortless cool that she brings to the table. Meanwhile, Jeremy Allen White's Rada the Hutt winds up being the only character in the movie with any dimension. We meet Rada while he's being held captive on Shikari as a gladiator for a powerful gangster, Lord Janu, but he's fairly comfortable with that arrangement. Rada seems glad to be regarded by the bloodthirsty crowds on his own merits rather than being judged by the sins of his father Jabba. So glad that he repeats that character motivation nearly word for word the second time we encounter him. White's natural, even-handed performance, Rada's sensitive way with Grogu, and the good ideas that Favreau does have for showing how a ripped Hutt would fight, like the gator death roll that he does on occasion, make him a welcome presence whenever he's on screen.
Yes!
Impressive.
The movie hints towards an intention to mine the interesting juxtaposition between Jabba and Rada and Mando and Grogu's father-son relationships early on, but it loses this thread by the time that Rada becomes less of an active part of the story in the second half. Star Wars Rebels' Zeb Aurelios, played by a returning Steve Blum, is also on hand as Mando's occasional pilot and New Republic liaison, and the two have some fun banter, but Zeb feels a little stuck between being a full-blown part of the story and an animated Star Wars cameo appearance that I can't imagine will get the general audiences the film seems to be focused on catering to all that excited. The Mandalorian and Grogu's one soaring achievement, the one reliably thrilling part of the movie, and so perhaps the clearest example of how ineffectively the rest of the movie mines the Star Wars universe for texture, is the crew of diminutive Anzellans that arrive halfway through to modify Mando's new Razor Crest ship. These little Babus frick wind up joining most of the action in the second half of the movie, and let me say this unequivocally, they will be the only thing about this movie that I remember with any real fondness next week.
shot, baby.
And that's not just because of the hilarious mutterings and wonderful puppeteering that bring them to life. Through the Anzellans, we get the occasional chance to step out of the nondescript, sanded down perspective of Mando and to see what life is like for these capable hard workers from nary a foot off the ground. They have a tiny spaceship that Grogu looks like a giant in, and the abject hilarity of that imagery aside, it's one of the only effective ways that the movie deploys the idea that Grogu is slowly growing up and coming into his own. But if you've got a bad feeling about salvaged creatures with silly voices from The Rise of Skywalker having room to be the best part of a movie called The Mandalorian and Grogu, there's not much here to make that feeling go away.
We've all heard stories of the Mandalorian bounty hunter and a child.
And so I'm giving The Mandalorian and Grogu a 5. It's another 2 hours and change of watching Din Djarin and his adorable green son fly to some planets and clear out rooms of monsters or gangsters every 20 minutes or so. But this is a Star Wars movie missing the thrills, the surprises, the challenges, the novelty, and a vested interest in seeing its characters grow and change. This is not the way.
Let's save the rest for after dinner.
Thank you for watching. For more reviews, check out what we thought of Mortal Kombat 2 and The Punisher: One Last Kill. For everything else Star Wars, you are already in the right place. IGN.